Today, 25th of May, 2026, in the early hours before dawn broke over the Persian Gulf, U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon aircraft picked up unusual radio chatter from IRGC command nodes near Bandar Abbas. Tanker traffic that normally hugged the narrow shipping lanes suddenly began veering eastward, captains responding to unconfirmed alerts of heightened missile activity along the Iranian coastline. What looked like a routine patrol quickly shifted as Aegis-equipped destroyers repositioned their radar arrays, locking onto potential fast-moving contacts that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The tension inside CENTCOM forward operations was palpable because this was no ordinary weekend. Memorial Day observances in the United States had been overshadowed by urgent White House briefings, where President Trump reportedly remained on site instead of retreating to Mar-a-Lago. Leave for key strike units was quietly canceled. Pre-positioned bombers at Diego Garcia stayed fueled and armed, while Delta Force elements maintained heightened readiness near forward staging areas. The situation escalated when intelligence streams indicated an IRGC-linked plot targeting a member of Trump's inner circle had been disrupted, adding a personal edge to already razor-sharp military calculations. Yet instead of the expected barrage of precision strikes under Operation Epic Fury, reports began filtering through diplomatic backchannels that Iranian officials had conveyed a written commitment, essentially signaling a dramatic pivot away from confrontation. This development did not ease concerns. It deepened them because the language coming out of Tehran and the interpretations emerging from Washington diverged in ways that exposed critical vulnerabilities in any potential agreement. Iranian sources framed the nuclear question as deferred to future negotiations, while U.S. officials insisted the memorandum required the immediate relinquishment of highly enriched uranium stockpiles, specifically the roughly 440 kilograms, enriched to 60% purity, that had become the central flashpoint of the entire. That single discrepancy carried enormous weight. If the uranium handover was verifiable, it represented a significant strategic victory for American pressure tactics, rolling back Iran's breakout capability without direct kinetic engagement. If it proved illusory, or subject to later reinterpretation, critics warned it could unravel the painstaking leverage built through months of sanctions, naval deployments, and targeted operations that had squeezed Iranian supply lines and proxy networks. The real danger lay not just in the details on paper, but in the window it created for miscalculation. Commercial satellite passes over Natanz and Fordo facilities showed continued activity levels, inconsistent with full compliance, while electronic intelligence picked up internal IRGC communications, expressing defiance even as political leadership appeared to bend. What terrified energy traders monitoring the situation was not an immediate missile launch, but the possibility that underwriters would pull coverage for Gulf transits entirely, sending insurance premiums into uncharted territory and forcing reroutes that could add billions in global shipping costs. Oil benchmarks reacted with sharp volatility, even as diplomats raced to clarify terms. Meanwhile, the interconnected nature of these pressures became impossible to ignore. As Iran appeared to edge toward this understanding with the United States, Russia unleashed one of its most intense barrages against Ukrainian positions around Kiev, combining Shahed drone swarms, cruise missiles, and the advanced Oreshnik hypersonic system in a coordinated assault designed to exploit perceived Western distraction. Ukrainian forces responded with their own deep strikes against Russian naval assets in the Black Sea and oil infrastructure further east, demonstrating that the tempo of that theater remained unforgiving. The timing raised immediate questions among strategic analysts watching both conflicts. Did Tehran believe a deal with Washington might isolate Moscow? Or did the Kremlin accelerate operations to prevent any perception of Iranian weakness from encouraging similar pressure elsewhere? Chinese naval formations simultaneously expanded their presence in the waters east of Taiwan, conducting live-fire drills that tested response times from U.S. and allied assets in the region. Virginia-class submarines maintained their silent patrols through critical choke points, while WC-135R reconnaissance aircraft continued sniffing for any nuclear-related signatures that might indicate Iranian hedging. These overlapping developments illustrated how fragile the global balance had become. A single misinterpreted communication or delayed verification step could cascade across theaters, linking energy security in the Middle East to frontline logistics in Eastern Europe and deterrence calculations in the Indo-Pacific. Defense officials monitoring the situation understood that institutional caution in Tehran stemmed partly from internal fractures. Hardline elements within the IRGC feared any concession would signal weakness to domestic audiences already strained by economic isolation. Yet the alternative, facing sustained U.S. carrier presence in the Arabian Sea, backed by B-52 contingents, and advanced drone overwatch, left limited maneuvering room. The contradiction at the heart of the reported understanding became even more pronounced when Pakistani intermediaries suggested talks remained fluid, hinting that the final text might include escape clauses that could render the uranium commitment symbolic rather than binding. This ambiguity introduced new operational risks. U.S. planners had to weigh whether to maintain maximum pressure posture or de-escalatory steps that might be exploited if Iranian commitments proved hollow. Satellite imagery shared through open-source channels revealed subtle shifts in Iranian missile transporter erector launcher positions, movements that could represent either defensive repositioning or preparation for renewed standoff. Electronic warfare activity spiked along the Strait of Hormuz as both sides tested jamming capabilities and signal resilience. The silence from certain European allies, traditionally vocal on Iran policy, stood out as particularly telling. Their hesitation reflected deeper fears about energy market contagion and the potential for refugee flows or proxy flare-ups that could spill beyond the immediate region. Markets reacted before politicians could frame the narrative, with Brent crude futures swinging on every unconfirmed leak. If you are finding value in this detailed breakdown of the hidden dynamics driving these global tensions, make sure to subscribe to OK Samu for continued frontline analysis that cuts through the surface reporting. The psychological pressure on command structures in Washington involved balancing the apparent diplomatic opening against the need to protect credibility built through recent operations. Canceled military leaves and sustained high alert status reflected the understanding that this moment was not a resolution, but a pivot point loaded with uncertainty. What happened if verification teams encountered resistance at enrichment sites, or if proxy militias in Iraq and Yemen interpreted the news as capitulation and launched independent actions to salvage pride? These micro-tensions layered atop the larger geopolitical chessboard created a situation where every update carried potential for rapid escalation. Russian advances in Ukraine, though geographically distant, directly influenced energy calculations that affected Iranian leverage. Higher oil prices from Black Sea disruptions could theoretically ease Tehran's financial pain, reducing the incentive to fully commit on uranium. China's naval posturing near Taiwan added another dimension, forcing Pentagon planners to consider force allocation trade-offs. Could the U.S. sustain carrier groups in multiple theaters without stretching air-wing maintenance cycles and munition stocks too thin? Intelligence assessments suggested Beijing watch the Iran situation closely, calibrating its own risk tolerance based on how firmly Washington enforced any emerging agreement. The Oreshnik strikes on Kyiv served as a reminder that hypersonic capabilities were no longer theoretical, compressing decision timelines for air defense operators worldwide. In the Gulf, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers adjusted their stations closer to vulnerable tanker routes, their SPY-1 radars sweeping arcs that now included potential drone infiltration paths from Iranian coastal launch sites. Open-source analysts pored over commercial imagery, showing activity around underground facilities, noting patterns that contradicted public statements from Tehran. These discrepancies fueled speculation that the reported surrender framing masked a more complex bargaining process, where Iran sought sanctions relief in exchange for partial, reversible steps on its nuclear program. The real nightmare scenario involved one misread radar contact, leading to an accidental exchange that could collapse the fragile diplomatic track entirely. Military planners shifted focus from outright victory conditions to containment of uncontrolled escalation, recognizing that institutional fear of broader war shaped every public statement. Selective leaks from both sides served information warfare purposes, testing resolve while shaping international perceptions. The economic consequences extended far beyond immediate oil prices. European LNG terminals faced renewed uncertainty about winter stockpiles if Gulf flows were disrupted, while Asian buyers scrambled for alternative cargoes that drove up freight rates across the Indian Ocean. This ripple effect connected directly to Ukraine's battlefield sustainability because higher energy costs strained Western aid budgets and political will. Alliances showed subtle strains, as quieter voices within NATO questioned the wisdom of simultaneous high-intensity commitments. The assassination plot element added personal stakes that influenced internal White House deliberations, reinforcing the perception that Iranian networks retained reach even under pressure. Yet the uranium question ultimately decided the strategic value of any understanding. At 60% enrichment, the material sat uncomfortably close to weapons-grade thresholds, shortening breakout timelines to weeks under certain scenarios. Verifiable removal or dilution of that stockpile would represent a genuine setback for Iranian ambitions, buying time for longer-term diplomatic architecture. Without it, the entire exercise risked becoming a dangerous trap that allowed Tehran breathing space to reconstitute capabilities. While international attention drifted, defense technology angles entered the picture as well, with U.S. advancements in drone interception and hypersonic tracking being tested in real time across multiple regions. The next 72 hours loomed large because verification mechanisms required physical access and technical cooperation that could evaporate quickly if political winds shifted in Tehran. IRGC hardliners maintained parallel channels that might undermine civilian leadership commitments. This internal Iranian dynamic mirrored similar fractures observed in other theaters, where centralized control faced challenges from field commanders. Satellite reconnaissance continued feeding data into fusion centers, where analysts cross-referenced movements with signals intelligence to build a coherent picture. The repositioning of THAAD batteries and Patriot systems around key Gulf installations reflected prudent hedging against the possibility that diplomacy might collapse without warning. What governments feared privately was not just tactical surprise, but the erosion of deterrence credibility if the deal appeared too concessionary. Public messaging therefore emphasized strength and verification while behind closed doors. Contingency packages remained active. The interconnected system meant that progress on the Iran file could indirectly relieve pressure on Russian logistics by stabilizing energy markets or conversely embolden Moscow if perceived as American distraction. Chinese military exercises in the Taiwan Strait served as both demonstration and probe, assessing Allied response times while the U.S. maintained assets near Iran. This global layering created a strategic environment where no single development could be viewed in isolation. Unexplained silences from certain intelligence agencies added to the atmosphere of calculated ambiguity. OSINT communities filled some gaps by tracking commercial vessel movements and aircraft transponders, revealing patterns that official channels avoided confirming. The danger of cyber disruption targeting verification teams or communication nodes remained a constant background concern, as electronic warfare capabilities had proliferated across all involved parties. Mine detection assets in the Gulf operated at elevated tempo because even limited seabed interference could close critical sea lanes for days. These operational realities grounded the high-level diplomatic narrative in gritty tactical vulnerability. The situation became even more layered when considering logistical corridors feeding proxy forces. Supply routes through Iraq and Syria showed signs of adjustment, possibly anticipating shifts in Iranian support levels, depending on deal outcomes. Troop estimates for involved militias fluctuated based on observed training activity captured through drone surveillance. Each new data point introduced fresh questions about sincerity and sustainability. Markets reacted with characteristic speed, pricing in both optimism around de-escalation and the persistent risk of reversal. This duality kept volatility elevated, affecting everything from airline fuel surcharges to defense contractor stock performance. Institutional psychology played heavily here. Officials avoided direct statements that might lock them into positions difficult to adjust when new intelligence arrived. Selective leaks occurred at moments designed to shape adversary behavior without committing to irreversible action. The real pressure point remained the physical disposition of that enriched uranium stockpile and the transparency surrounding its handling. Without independent verification, any agreement existed more in the realm of political theater than concrete security architecture. What happened next would test whether the reported pivot represented genuine strategic recalibration or tactical delay. U.S. forces maintained their posture with carriers like the Eisenhower and Roosevelt battle groups, projecting power across vast distances, while reconnaissance aircraft mapped potential threat axes. The Oreshnik employment in Ukraine demonstrated technological proliferation that could eventually reach other conflict zones, shortening warning times and complicating defense planning everywhere. Taiwan's Strait movements forced additional resource considerations, highlighting the challenge of managing simultaneous peer and regional threats. The assassination plot revelation injected an element of personal risk that complicated purely geopolitical calculations, reminding participants that human elements and vendettas could override doctrinal restraint. This factor likely influenced the urgency behind exploring diplomatic off-ramps, even while military options stayed live. Open-source evidence continued mounting through vessel tracking data and imagery analysis, painting a picture more complex than headline summaries allowed. The contradictions between Iranian and American characterizations of the memorandum created space for critics to argue either excessive optimism or hidden capitulation depending on perspective. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf region remained on high alert, with redundant systems prepared for potential disruption scenarios. Shipping companies rerouted vessels preemptively, adding costs that would eventually reach consumers worldwide. These economic signals fed back into political decision-making loops, constraining options on all sides. The fluidity of the situation meant that assessments could shift within hours based on new intercepts or satellite passes. Military movements, though subtle, carried outsized signaling value in such an environment. If you want geopolitical analysis that exposes the hidden logic behind these global crises, subscribe to OK Samu and stay ahead of the curve. As hours ticked by, the unresolved elements accumulated. Verification protocols needed testing against real-world access challenges. Proxy networks required monitoring to prevent spoiler actions. Alliance coordination demanded careful messaging to maintain unity without revealing operational details. The danger of accidental escalation never fully receded because overloaded sensors, communication lags, and human judgment under pressure created inevitable friction points. Hypersonic threats compressed response windows further, forcing doctrinal adjustments across theaters. The situation remains fluid, with governments balancing public statements against private risk assessments. Open-source intelligence provides valuable windows into these developments, but cannot capture every classified deliberation shaping outcomes. The next phase will likely determine whether this apparent shift leads to durable stability or sets conditions for more intense confrontation when underlying contradictions surface. The interconnected pressures across regions ensure that developments here will echo far beyond the immediate geography, influencing power balances for years ahead. The tension persists because the core issues of capability, verification, and strategic intent have not yet been fully reconciled, leaving the door open to rapid change. Subscribe now, OK Samu.